Welcome to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology of the San Marcos University, and this edition of Conversation at the San Marcos University Museum. Today, we are honored to introduce to the Dr. Richard Daggett, retired professor at the University of Massachusetts. In the last 18 years, the Dr. Richard Daggett has carried out a series of investigations regarding the life and work of the archaeologist Julio Cesar Tello, who was the director of the Museum of Archaeology at our university. Julio Cesar Tello has been the founder of Peruvian archaeology and selected as one of the intellectuals of the bicentennial. For this reason, Dr. Daggett will then present a brief research entitled Julio Cesar Tello, the driving force behind the creation of Peru's infraestructure to protect the national heritage. Welcome, Dr. Richard Daggett.
Thank you very much, Juan. Thank you all. Thank you all. Today, I would like to talk to you about aspects of Dr. Julio C. Tello's professional life that I believe have not received the attention they deserve. When Tello began his career, there was no National Museum of Anthropology or Archaeology. Neither was there a Museum of Archaeology at the University of San Marcos, or even a program of study within San Marcos focused on archaeology. A recognizable predecessor to what was to become the National Institute of Culture was not even on the horizon. Today, these are all critical pieces of the government's infrastructure dedicated to the protection, preservation, and scientific study of Peru's national heritage. Yet none of this existed before Tello made the commitment to make it so. In great part, it was through his remarkable perseverance that all this was created. Drawing from a variety of sources, including the Peruvian press, I would like to briefly present the fascinating history of how Tello was able to accomplish this. All that he had to accomplish all that he did to help the governmental framework be constructed, of which I speak. To begin with, I need to present some background information. It was on April 30th, 1909, that Tello passed his exams and was awarded the degree of surgeon from the San Marcos School of Medicine. Then, in a government resolution dated August 21st that year, he was granted a 2-year scholarship to study anthropology at Harvard University. Why anthropology, you might ask? Though not a formal course of study at San Marcos at this time, Tello had undertaken archaeological and linguistic fieldwork at the suggestion of the natural historian and linguist Jose Barranca. And for his thesis on the antiquity of syphilis in Peru, Tello had undertaken a detailed analysis of skulls he had collected at pre-Columbian cemeteries. In this way, he had undertaken studies in 3 of the 4 subfields of anthropology that he would have been studying at Harvard. These studies Tello had undertaken at a time when the government had made the decision to create a National Museum of History, and then invite the German archaeologist Max Uhle to serve as the director of the archaeological section in this museum. Uhle was in the process of excavating at sites in and around Lima when Tello presented a talk about discoveries he had made at pre-Columbian cemeteries. This was his first such talk, and Uhle was in attendance. Later, during his visits to the National Museum, Tello would have had the opportunity to interact with Uhle. In this way, Tello would have been able to keep an eye on the museum's ever-growing collections of artifacts that Uhle was in the process of obtaining, both through purchase and through excavation. Tello sailed for the U.S. in September 1909 and graduated from Harvard with a master's degree in anthropology in June of 1911. He was then given a 1-year extension of his scholarship to study abroad in a resolution dated September 2nd. This gave him the opportunity to continue his studies in Germany, France, and England before returning to Peru in January 1913. During the interim, Uhle had become the sole director of the National Museum, and he had begun to turn its emphasis towards science. In this role, Uhle had begun to complain to the government about a surge in the looting of archaeological sites, especially on the South Coast. He pressed the government to not only put a stop to the practice of looting, but also to put a stop to the sale and export of discovered artifacts. This infuriated some, and a concerted effort was made to oust him as director of the National Museum. Ultimately, the government decided not to renew Uli's contract. One of the things Tello did after arriving back in Lima at the beginning of 1913 was to ask that he be allowed to take part in an ongoing archaeological expedition. Then, on March 23rd, Tello published in La Prensa his official report. It contains surprisingly few details regarding the expedition. Instead, Tello focused on the subject of illegal excavations then plaguing the country. He essentially declared war on all of those involved in a system that permitted the wholesale destruction of archaeological sites in order to satisfy the demand of collectors, both institutional and individual, who wanted artifacts to fill museums, both public and private, situated both inside and outside Peru. While Tello applauded the commendable attempts made by authorities and educated elite in Lima to stem the tide of illegal activity, he noted his concern that recent laws enacted to both control excavations and impede the shipment of the collections had proven ineffective. In his report, Tello placed what was happening within historical context. He traced the ongoing destructive practice of the looting of archaeological sites back to the time of the conquest, and the resultant brutal mistreatment of indigenous peoples that stemmed from what he said was the lie that indigenous culture was of little value because it had never achieved greatness. Tello went on to say that he had learned while studying abroad that all races had the potential for greatness, and that in fact such greatness had been achieved in Peru prior to the conquest. This being the case, he said, it was time to preserve and study the indigenous culture of Peru, both past and present, and to educate those who were ignorant of its value. Education, he said, was the key to creating a future, all-inclusive national identity, and the science of anthropology provided the tools with which to achieve this end. In this way, he proposed the creation of a National Museum of Anthropology run by a professional. Not long after publishing this report, Tello successfully petitioned the government to create for him the position of chief of the archaeological section of the National Museum of History. In his request, he emphasized the urgent need to oversee the nation's archaeological patrimony, and he pointed out that the museum's anthropological section suffered from neglect. This began what was proved to be a 2-year campaign on the part of Tello to wrest control of the museum from an art historian who only the year before had been appointed to replace Uli as its director. Somehow this had happened despite the fact that Tello had heard while in Europe that Peru had been seeking a foreign archaeologist to replace Uli. So intense was this fight between Tello and his opponent that the government was forced to shut the museum down and issue a decree dividing it into separate museums of archaeology and history. As museum director, Tello engaged in what became an increasingly nasty debate with a noted and classically trained historian over the relative value of using history or science in the study of Peru's pre-Columbian past. This debate took place in the pages of La Crónica during the months of December 1914 to January 1915. In this debate, Tello championed the need to use science and employ the scientific method as he had been taught at Harvard, clearly implying that he alone in Peru had the qualifications to do so. Tello was naive enough to think that this would be an intellectual debate, but he soon learned that his opponent had served in the Chamber of Deputies, and there he had honed skills that Tello lacked. Tello was forced to defend his intellectual integrity and his patriotism, the latter charge coming after he had said that San Marcos was 50 years behind Harvard in offering classes pertinent to the study of pre-Columbian cultures. Later, in January, and not long after the conclusion of the debate in La Crónica, a political coup that took place in Lima took down the sitting president and brought new administrative oversight of the National Museum. To his dismay, Tello soon realized that he could no longer count on help from within the government to support his fight to take complete control of the museum. As a result, he resigned toward the end of March 1915. A few months later, Tello conducted an exploration of the South Coast to ascertain the provenience of artifacts that Uli had acquired prior to 1913. In this task, he made a point of interacting with known arqueros and collectors. In Pisco, he purchased, with the help of 2 friends, a collection of especially fine textiles said to have come from that valley. He had previously seen examples of such textiles on sale in shops in Lima, and he wanted to know more about them. Tello's luck changed at the end of 1915. Javier Prado was named rector of San Marcos. In the inaugural speech that he gave in January 1916, Prado said that the university should either take over the National Museum of History or else the museum should be placed under the technical and administrative control of the university. Suddenly, Tello had an important ally in its fight to take control of the National Museum. Prado, it should be noted, owned an impressive collection of pre-Columbian artifacts, and this would certainly have attracted Tello's attention. Two, it should be noted that Tello had undertaken a trip to the US at the end of 1915 to attend a pair of international congresses, and he did not return until a couple of months later. So it seems likely that prior to leaving for the US, Tello had discussed with Prado the need to make a change in leadership at the National Museum. In any case, Prado's public statement would have alerted the director of the National Museum to the fact that his position at the museum was more insecure than ever. A second piece of good fortune came Tello's way when a seat in the Chamber of Deputies became vacant in 1917. At the end of July that year, Tello was elected to represent his native province of Huarochirí. He wasted little time. On August 8th and again on the 4th of November, he proposed legislation to reorganize the National Museum of History under the guidance of San Marcos. Specifically, it was on November 4th that he proposed a law that would place the museum under the technical and administrative control of the university. Tello had apparently also proposed a second law during 1917, the debate on which was renewed on September 17, 1918. Tello had proposed that the Congress declare the state to be the owner of all constructions and artifacts dating to the pre-Columbian epoch through the first 25 years of the Republican epoch that were found above ground and below ground on both private and public property. As the debate widened, Tello argued that only those trained in the science of archaeology should be allowed to conduct excavations. Two, he argued that the state should be vested with the authority to prohibit the export of all artifacts, whether privately owned or not. He made the mistake, however, of alluding to the director of the National Museum of History in his arguments, and this served to reopen the debate on the fitness of the director to head a museum that included archaeological and anthropological collections. The debate continued on the 2nd of October, and supporters of the director repeated charges that had been made against Tello during his two-year tenure at the National Museum. Tello chose not to directly respond to these charges. Instead, he did so indirectly through a presentation of the history of the museum. This history he framed in terms of a struggle between the practitioners of science and the lovers of art. On the one side, he said, were scientists like he, while on the other side, he said, were collectors like the director of the museum. Tello made it abundantly clear that he was completely dedicated to the advancement of science, something that he deemed a noble cause and the wave of the future. Beyond the halls of the Chamber of Deputies, Tello actively pursued his connections with the university during 1918. This was to be his first step toward developing a program focused on the teaching of archaeology there. On August 6th, he was awarded his doctorate from the School of Science, graduating with a degree in natural sciences. Then on November 25th, he submitted a plan for a 4-month expedition to the Department of Ancash that was unanimously approved by the University Council. Readers of El Comercio were kept apprised of Tello's fieldwork in a report published during mid to late March 1919, in which it was stated that he had sent to the university 7 crates of artifacts. Attached to this news report was a copy of a telegram that Tello had sent to the university. In this telegram, he reported that he had explored the western slopes of the Callejón de Huaylas, and that in the province of Bahia, he had found 50 monoliths, all in an excellent state of conservation. Subsequently, Tello focused his research in the southern part of the Callejón before going to work at the famous ruins of Chavin. While a medical student at San Marcos, Tello would have had the opportunity to study with his mentor Barranca, a stela with complex inscriptions carved in relief that years before had been placed on display in Lima. The Italian naturalist Antonio Raimondi, a colleague of Barranca, had been the one to find his stela at the ruins of Chavin late in the previous century. In addition to Raimondi, others had also been to Chavin prior to 1919. But when Tello explored the distant and out-of-the-way ruins of Chavin that year, he was the first professional archaeologist to do so. During his explorations at Chavin, Tello, like Raimondi, also found a stele with complex designs carved in relief, the second one being used to decorate the church in the nearby town of that name. Following his work at the ruins of Chavin, Tello spent 2 months exploring the surrounding provinces, after which time he returned to the Callejon and concentrated on an exploration of the northern part of this highland valley. In late May, numerous artifacts collected by Tello were placed on exhibit in a salon at San Marcos. In addition to a number of Aja stone figures, the exhibited material included pottery, textiles, stone objects, tracings of engraved stones, and maps. The city's newspapers and magazines reported on the exhibit. Variedades, for example, published on an interview its reporter had conducted with Tello. In answer to a question about ownership, Tello said everything he had found in Ancash and brought back to Lima belonged to the university that had co-sponsored the expedition along with the government. He highlighted the role that Prado as rector and said Prado was a passionate supporter of archaeology who was in the process of creating various museums and laboratories on the campus, including ones dedicated to archaeology. The Ancash exhibit was on display in the university's newly opened Museum of Natural History and consisted of 1,000 artifacts, including carved stones taken from Chavin. In early July, after a strongly contested election, supporters of Augusto B. Leguía installed him as the nation's president. As for Tello, he won re-election a couple of months later. Then on October 21st, the University Council designated Tello as director of the university's new Museum of Archaeology. In this way, a first piece in a governmental framework dedicated to protect, preserve, and to scientifically study the national heritage came to be. Subsequently, Tello agreed to act on behalf of the wealthy businessman Victor Laco to undertake the creation for him of a private museum of archaeology in Lima. Tello agreed to do so under the condition that the museum be a scientific institution. He then initiated contact with potential sellers of archaeological collections on behalf of Laco during the first half of October. Over a period of 5 months, a select collection of 20,000 artifacts were purchased. This private museum, with Tello as its director, was officially founded in Lima on November 3rd, 1919. It was also during 1919 that Tello began giving talks at the university, while during the first half of 1920, he initiated discussions with a few of his San Marcos colleagues concerning the creation of a scientific society in advance of Peru's upcoming centennial celebration. This ultimately resulted in the government issuing a Supreme Resolution dated July 24th that recognized the creation of the Peruvian Society for the Progress of Science. Tello presented a report on his Ancash expedition at the June 13th, 1921 session of the Society. Among other matters, he reported that the expedition resulted in the collection of 2,011 archaeological specimens that have been sent to San Marcos, inclusive of 53 fragments of stones engraved with mystical designs, some of which he had found at Chavin. In promoting a welcome atmosphere on campus for the teaching of science, Tello was advancing toward his goal of establishing the teaching of archaeology at the university. Yet, Tello remained fixated on his goal of converting the National Museum into one dedicated to the study of anthropology, even to the point of using a proxy to pressure the director to resign. On the 28th of November, 1920, it was reported in Lima's The West Coast Leader that by executive decree, an American had been contracted to serve as, quote, the director of the National Museum of Archaeology, that had formerly been the archaeological section of the National Museum of History, end of quote. So, just as it had happened during Tello's tenure, the National Museum's archaeological section was converted into a separate museum. Not surprisingly, Tello had been the one to suggest that the Leguía administration hire this person who possessed not only a Harvard degree, but who also possessed archaeological experience working in Peru. In this way, Tello hoped to continue applying pressure on the museum director to get him to resign. His plan did not work. In addition to the fact that the American got along with the director, it was also the American who, for reasons of fiscal mismanagement, was forced to resign in early March 1921. This was not to be Tello's only disappointment at this time. On May 10, 1921, Laco destroyed a collection of tracings of Moche and Nazca designs at his museum. Tello responded by immediately resigning. 3 days later, he asked Laco for a letter of recommendation. Laco complied without hesitation. In his letter, Laco noted that Tello had served him at the museum from October 1919 to May 1921. He went on to say that Tello, in addition to classifying the museum's artifacts, had undertaken the repair, conservation, and maintenance of the museum's textiles, following accepted technical practices in use in foreign museums. So, in a span of 2 months, Tello had seen his American friend lose control of the newly reconstituted National Museum of Archaeology, and Tello himself had been forced by circumstances to resign his position at the Laco Museum. That left Tello with just one museum directorship, and even that position was on shaky ground. At this time, students and faculty at San Marcos were upset at the Leguía government. A strike held during May resulted in the closure of the university and the ousting of Prado as rector. He died not long thereafter. Given this shocking event, other problems seemed petty, but it should be noted that a lack of space and insufficient funding meant that Tello was only able to exhibit but a tiny portion of the museum's collections. After a period of distress, these problems were resolved when the government decided to increase funding for the museum. That Tello served on a congressional committee charged with reconciling the differences between the university and the government may help to explain the improvement in his position at the university. In anticipation of the nation's upcoming centennial celebration, the government provided a new locale for the university's archaeological museum, presumably with enlarged space for exhibition. In addition, increased funding allowed Tello to begin publishing in 1923 a museum journal he named Inca. In its first issue, Tello published his analysis of the mystical designs engraved in stone that he had seen at Chavin and at other places in the Department of Ancash. In the second issue published that year, Rebecca Carrion-Cottrell published her first article on archaeology. In this article, she indicated her gratitude in having had the opportunity to work for Tello the previous 2 years, first with him at the Laco Museum and then at the San Marcos Museum of Archaeology. Later, Carrion reported that Tello had begun teaching classes in general anthropology at San Marcos in 1923, and that during the second half of 1924, he had offered his first seminar on archaeology there. She took this seminar, as did Toribio Mejia Sepe, who later recalled that classes had begun at 7 in the morning, that Tello had always been very focused, and at the end of the semester, Tello had taken the students to the ruins of Cajamarquilla. There he left them with instructions to explore the ruins and then write up a report to be handed in the following morning. Mejia was the only one to interview locals, and Tello was very impressed. This earned Mejia a job offer that he gladly accepted. By teaching classes in archaeology, Tello added to the government's infrastructure to advance the protection, preservation, and scientific study of the nation's heritage. Tello also continued to argue in the Chamber of Deputies for the need to protect this heritage. This he did at the end of the 1924 legislative session. Approved and sent to the Senate was a law he proposed that would see to the creation of a registry of antiquities, aimed at stopping the practice of illegal excavations, as well as the practice of selling the products of these excavations. In addition, his proposed law included provisions aimed at curbing the shipment of illegally obtained artifacts to destinations both inside and outside Peru. At the very end of 1924, negotiations behind the scenes between Laco and the Leguía government finally came to a successful conclusion, and the Laco Museum was purchased. Its name was changed to the Museum of Peruvian Archaeology, and Tello was appointed as director. It's unknown if Tello in any way took part in these negotiations. In any case, it's in recognition of the fact that he was the only professional archaeologist in Peru, and in recognition of the fact that he had dedicated himself to the creation of a National Museum of Anthropology, Tello was rewarded by the government in naming him the director of the new National Museum of Archaeology. It was in this way that the government's infrastructure designed to protect, preserve, and scientifically study the national heritage was expanded. Mejia and Carrion were among those who were assigned to undertake the mandated inventory of the new museum, the latter of whom sometime in 1925 was awarded her bachelor's degree at San Marcos. Whether this was a degree with a concentration in archaeology is unknown. It was in mid-1925 that a Harvard grad and noted archaeologist introduced himself to Tello and suggested that they undertake an exploration. This provided Tello with a unique opportunity to return to the South Coast to search for the source of the spectacular textiles that he had purchased in 1915. In Pisco, he made inquiries. This resulted in he and his companion being guided to the source of these textiles at looted cemeteries on the Paracas Peninsula. With the help of Mejia, Tello then conducted excavations at this place to the benefit of the National Museum. Unfortunately, once worked at by Tello and his staff, these cemeteries became an even greater magnet for looters, even some serving in the armed forces. The Navy conducted training for its cadets on the Paracas Peninsula at the start of 1926. And a group of sailors who had been sent on reconnaissance took the opportunity to illegally excavate and recover Paracas artifacts. When he learned of this, Tello angrily denounced the government in the extraordinary session of the Chamber of Deputies held early in 1926. This resulted in the offending sailors being disciplined and being forced to hand over the artifacts that they had illegally acquired. The government was likewise interested in the artifacts being found at Paracas and elsewhere on the South Coast. As director of the National Museum of Archaeology, Tello was provided funding to undertake excavations on the South Coast in anticipation of Peru taking part in an international exposition to be held at Seville, Spain. Early in 1927, Tello sent a team headed by Mejia to undertake this work. After working in the Nazca Valley, Mejia moved his team to the Paracas Peninsula, with instructions from Tello as to where to dig. This led to the discovery of an extraordinary cemetery from which were extracted more than 400 mummy models. For the most part, Tello stayed in Lima at this time, presumably in part teaching at San Marcos and in part continuing his fight for the passage of legislation designed to protect the national patrimony. In 1929, he chose not to run for re-election. This suggests that Tello was confident President Leguía would soon be signing legislation to his liking. This occurred during the latter part of 1929 with the creation of the National Board of Archaeology. This board was given oversight of the national patrimony and was headed by the Minister of Education. Other permanent positions on the board were given to the rector of San Marcos, the president of the Geographical Society of Lima, and delegates representing Peru's national museums of archaeology and of history, and the universities of Arequipa, Cusco, and Trujillo. Among those who were named to occupy a seat on this board was Tello. He remained a member of the board for the rest of his life. It was in this way that yet another part of the government's framework designed to protect, preserve, and scientifically study the nation's heritage was established. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not point out that Tello was not the only one to contribute toward the creation of this governmental framework. Certainly, countless individuals were involved, but it was Tello's leadership, both in public and in private, that provided the necessary inspiration. In essence, he was the architect, the driving force behind it all. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Daggett, the Museum for Archaeology and Anthropology of the San Marcos University. Thank you infinitely for sharing your insights regarding the work of Dr. Julio Cesar Tello. Above all, placing emphasis on the protection of archaeological heritage, on the creation of the National Board of Archaeology, and about the law number 6634 that the Julio Cesar Tello fought so hard. Thanks so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Daggett.
This has been fun. Thank you.